John Redwood.
Mr Deputy Speaker, let me deal first of all with an old canard from the Labour benches which is simply untrue and unfair. The idea that Conservatives welcome tax cuts for the rich but don't think tax cuts are appropriate for anybody else. We believe very strongly on these benches that tax cuts work for everybody, and that is why this government has spent a lot of tax revenue, has given back a lot of tax revenue to people on low pay by taking them out of tax altogether. We have supported that, we have welcomed that, and that is where the missing revenue that Labour worries about is concentrated.
I thank the honourable member for giving way. The honourable member says that his party is taking many people, low-income people, out of tax. But he must recognise that by raising value-added tax, the least progressive of taxes, the taxation that everyone has to pay, regardless of their income, if they are purchasing goods, he must recognise that he has increased the burden on the lowest paid.
That is not as regressive as the Honourable Lady is suggesting, because I'm very pleased to say that important items like food and children's clothes are completely VAT exempt, which makes it a little less unpalatable. But all tax rises are bad news, I agree with the Honourable Lady, but they are a necessity when we inherited a very large deficit and when there are some important public services that need financing. And I agree with Labour on one other point, then I will take the intervention. I entirely agree with Labour that given that we have a very large deficit and given that we need to spend money on important benefits and public services, we need to get that money from the rich and the better off. They are the people with the money, and we have to find the best way of getting the money off them. I entirely agree. I give way.
Could I just say to the honourable member, that why is he so scared of this particular clause? Because all it's doing is requesting a report. Surely he's supportive of the idea of having a report on these issues so we can actually get to the bottom of this matter.
Mr Deputy Speaker, if I'm given a chance to develop my argument, I hope I will satisfy any independent-minded people on the Labour benches that we already have the evidence, and we've had a very long-term experiment on this very subject which satisfies some of us that the way to get more money off the rich is to set a rate that they are prepared to pay, and they will stay and pay. If you set the rate too high, they leave. If you set the rate too high, their clever lawyers and accountants find entirely legal ways of paying rather less tax than you would like. And the Honourable Lady didn't answer my intervention when I said, would she confirm that the Red Book has made clear that after the cut in the rate, the amount that the better off and the rich paid went up? Of course it did. That is the experience that you would expect. The Honourable Lady is left trying to say that there are special reasons. Well, I will give her this point, that it is probably best to judge these things over a longer period than a year or two, and you can get odd variations, which is why I want to give the evidence to the House that they've clearly forgotten, which relates to the very big reductions in top rate tax that were put through in the 1980s, when a Conservative government... Let me just make this point, and then I will give way. A Conservative government took the top rate of tax down in two stages, from 83% to 60%, and from 60% to 40%, and the incoming Labour government kept that 40% rate right up until the time when they knew they were going to lose office. And they were very wise to do so, because what happened over a period of years with those lower rates was the amount of cash the rich paid went up, the real terms amount of tax the rich paid went up, and the proportion of the total income tax paid by the rich went up. What is not to like about that treble win? I give way.
I'm grateful to the right honourable gentleman for giving way. He said earlier that if the top rate of tax was too high, then people would leave. I presume he means leave the country. So as a result of the top rate being reduced from 50p to 45p, how many rich people have returned to the country?
Mr. Speaker, we will in due course be able to answer that question, but these are still quite early days. But it looks as if it is encouraging signs because there is more revenue coming in from the rich. But we will know later on the latest experiment, but we know fully the results of the 1980s tax cuts, and they were convincing enough, not just to convince all sensible Conservative MPs at the time, who were very happy to vote for those cuts and kept them throughout their period in office, but more importantly, from the Labour point of view, they convinced the long-running Chancellor of the Exchequer, who took office in 1997 and held it for a decade before becoming Prime Minister. Not an easy man to convince to be nice to the rich, Mr. Deputy Speaker. And I think he decided to run with that 40% tax rate because he was entirely convinced that you got more money out of the rich at 40% than you did at 83% or 60%.
To the right honourable gentleman, doesn't the evidence actually show that any increase in tax paid by the rich is because their share of income has risen at the very time when everyone else's living standards are falling?
Of course, the main reason they pay more tax is they declare more income here and they generate more income here. Surely that is what we want them to do. If the Labour Party is with me so far in wanting decent public services, and if they're with me in accepting that the money for those public services has to come from the better off, because by definition we don't want to tax the poor, then surely they're with me in wanting more rich people to be here and more rich people to venture and to save and to put their money at risk and to make more money with their money so that there is more money to tax. And this country is very dependent now on the income tax from the top group of earners who now produce 30% of the income tax, very dependent on them for the capital gains tax and the stamp duty and the other taxes that mainly relate to people with big assets and who are rich, and that is sustaining the public services. So it is very important that this House may not like these people, clearly the party opposite dislikes them intensely, but they must see that they are very useful members of society, that their revenue is absolutely crucial to being able to redistribute money around the country, and that as they wish to have more equality, they must think about the sustainable rate, the optimising rate. Surely it is best to try and find the rate which maximises the revenue rather than a penal rate which satisfies people's sense of jealousy or whatever it is about people who make a lot of money or have a lot of money. Yeah.
I just want to pick up on his point about disliking rich people intensely. That is wrong, and he should retract that. And if he's not prepared to, perhaps he will explain why many people will feel his party dislike ordinary families and poor families intensely, and their policies highlight that.
Simply untrue. I accept the Honourable Lady likes rich people. I'm delighted to hear that she does, and there are quite a few in her party, so let's hope she gets on well with them. But it's absolutely false to suggest that Conservatives have no interest in people who are out of tax altogether or are on low incomes. We are desperately concerned that they get better educational standards, that they have more opportunity, that they can get a job and then they can go on to get a better job. We wish them well. All those who live in our constituencies, we're very keen to work with them so that they can have opportunities to take advantage, and we would like them to be on higher incomes. And in the meantime, unlike the government she supported, we've taken many, many more of them out of tax altogether, because we think if you're on an income of under 10,000 a year, you shouldn't be paying tax. You will probably be receiving some benefit assistance. And another point which the Honourable Lady didn't respond to when I asked was that the latest figures show that inequality rose under the Labour government and has actually fallen a bit under the coalition, and that is mainly because we've taken an awful lot of people out of tax at the lower end of the income scale. We have a very, very progressive system. If you combine both the income tax system, which now exempts anybody under 10,000 and has the 47% rate if you take national insurance as well, on the highest incomes, combined with a benefit system which rightly gives a lot of money to people at the low end of the scale and shouldn't give any money to people at the top end of the scale, I give way.
I just wonder whether or not he's made a number of assertions in those last few sentences. And I just wonder if he's seen the Joseph Rowntree Foundation report that's been published this week that actually says that the cuts in child benefit and tax credits have typically created losses double the amount of tax allowance gained for working couples and nearly 4 times for the amount for working lone parents. And I wonder whether or not he's seen the latest MRC report that actually says the Gini coefficient in 2012 and 13 has started to rise significantly.
Speaker, the figures I've been using refer to the whole coalition period, and they show some reduction in the inequality, which I would hope that he would welcome. And I don't recognise his figures on the child tax changes. The overall impact of taking a lot of people out of tax is very positive on their net incomes, as you would hope. I give way.
Grateful. Could I just ask the right honourable gentleman, if it is the case that he disputes whether or not the increase or decrease in the additional rate of tax brings in more or less money, would he agree with the new clause to be put into the finance bill, get the report, and my question to him would be, if it shows that the 50p tax rate brings in more money, would he advocate with his Conservative colleagues to increase it again?
Mr Deputy Speaker, I thought I dealt with that point. As far as I'm concerned, it was conclusively proven through the 80s that taking the rate down from 83 to 40 increased the revenue very substantially on a sustainable basis. And that was sufficient to persuade the whole official Labour Party, probably not some of the Labour colleagues we see here today, but it persuaded the whole official Labour Party never to put that 40% tax rate up throughout all those long years in government until the very end. I give way.
But doesn't he recognise that economic circumstances now are rather different to what he was talking about when he carried out that study? And surely what's needed is a study exactly in line with what is advocated in this amendment to enable us to look at the figures for what's happening now.
I don't think economic circumstances were as different as perhaps the honourable gentleman thinks they were. In the early 80s, the Conservative government inherited an economic crisis from Labour, just as this government inherited an economic crisis from Labour, and there was a lot of unemployment, and there was a big task to get people back to work and to get the economy growing again, rather like today, and the government then managed to do that just as the government is today. So I don't accept his point, but I do find the fact that Labour's going backwards on these issues rather perturbing. Why is it that the modern Labour Party cannot understand the very basic points that the Labour Party that was victorious between 1997 and 2010 understood fully? Why can't they understand that you can take a tax rate too high and you get in less revenue? The Treasury now has accepted the doctrine that there is a Laffer curve, that you can put the tax up above the optimising rate. And that surely is a very foolish thing to do. They know it applies to capital gains tax, it clearly also applies to income tax, and I would submit that 50 was well above the optimum rate. We collected rather less revenue than many people would have liked. I welcome the fact that they started to put that right. I don't think we need the particular study Labour is recommending today, and I would advise the Labour Party to have a think again about what it did learn in the 80s and 90s and what it has now forgotten. And it does show today that clearly the former Chancellor from the Labour government was not crowd-pleasing by refusing to put up the 40% rate. He was clearly antagonising a lot of his colleagues on the back benches by not doing that, so there must have been a good reason for it, and I think the reason was a very sensible one, that it would have raised less revenue rather than raising more revenue. So I urge the government, Mr Deputy Speaker, to reject this amendment.